Imagine a world where the Crusaders didn't just capture Jerusalem temporarily, but held it for centuries. What if the Crusades had truly succeeded, reshaping religion, politics, and even science forever? Stay with me, because this alternate history might just blow your mind. So, let's set the stage. The Crusades were a series of wars between Christian Europe and the Muslim powers of the Middle East. In our timeline, the Crusaders briefly took Jerusalem, but they could never hold it long term. Muslim forces under leaders like Saladin eventually pushed them back, and the Crusader states collapsed. But what if they didn't? What if the Crusaders managed not only to capture the Holy Land, but to defend it for centuries? First, the Middle East itself would look radically different. Instead of collapsing within a couple of centuries, the Crusader kingdoms could have become a permanent European colony planted deep inside the Islamic world. Imagine a network of fortified cities: Jerusalem, Antioch, Acre, all firmly controlled by European nobles, protected by castles and knightly orders, and governed under a feudal system transplanted straight from France or England. These territories wouldn't have been isolated outposts, but living bridges between East and West. With this foothold secured, Europe would have gained direct access to the riches of the Silk Road. Spices, silk, and precious metals could have been shipped straight through Crusader ports into the Mediterranean, bypassing Muslim middlemen and giving European merchants unprecedented wealth. Cities like Venice and Genoa, which thrived on trade in our timeline, would have exploded in power even earlier, possibly centuries before the Renaissance truly began. And this trade dominance might have completely reshaped world exploration. In our reality, Europe's hunger for new routes to Asia pushed explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama to sail into the unknown. But if Europeans already controlled the gateways to Asia through the Middle East, there might have been no urgency to find a westward path across the Atlantic. Instead of discovering the Americas, Europe's energy might have been focused on expanding eastward, strengthening its presence in Persia, India, and even China far earlier than it did in our timeline. This alternate trade empire could have made Europe wealthier, more connected, and far more powerful centuries ahead of schedule. The age of exploration would have looked completely different, or might never have happened in the way we know it. Religion, of course, would have been transformed in ways that are hard to overstate. If the Crusades had permanently succeeded, the Holy Land would not only have remained in European hands, but it might have become the symbolic and spiritual center of Christian Europe. Pilgrims from France, England, and Germany would have traveled in massive numbers to Jerusalem, turning it into a hub of Christian devotion. Enormous Gothic-style cathedrals might have risen where, in our timeline, great mosques and Islamic schools were built. Damascus, Antioch, and Jerusalem could have resembled European cities transplanted into the Middle East, decorated with crosses, monasteries, and castles belonging to knightly orders. For Islam, the impact would have been profound. Losing control over Jerusalem, considered the third holiest site in Islam, would have been a severe political and spiritual setback. The unity of the Muslim world, which in our timeline eventually coalesced under strong empires like the Mamluks and Ottomans, might have been fractured or delayed. Islamic powers might have shifted their centers of influence further east, to Persia or even Central Asia, rather than focusing on the Mediterranean. This doesn't mean Islam as a faith would have disappeared. It had deep roots across vast regions, but its political dominance in the Middle East could have looked very different. At the same time, Christianity's prestige in Europe would have skyrocketed. The Pope, who had called for the Crusades in the first place, would have gained immense authority, presenting the conquest as proof that God's will had been fulfilled. European monarchs, too, would have gained legitimacy by supporting and defending the Crusader states, tying their dynasties to the Holy Land itself. In this alternate reality, the religious map of the Middle East might have shifted dramatically. Instead of minarets and call to prayer, travelers in Jerusalem might have heard church bells ringing across the city, symbolizing a lasting Christian presence where, in our timeline, Islamic culture remained dominant. Culturally, though, The changes would have been fascinating. With Europeans permanently embedded in the Middle East, cultural exchange wouldn't have been an occasional event, it would have been part of daily life. Crusader rulers, soldiers, and settlers would have interacted constantly with local Muslim and Jewish populations, creating opportunities for knowledge and traditions to move in both directions. Arabic science, mathematics, and medicine, which were thriving at the time, might have spread into Europe far more quickly. Fields like astronomy, surgical techniques, and algebra could have reached Western universities earlier, giving Europe a significant intellectual boost. At the same time, European influence would have reshaped the Middle East itself. Castles, knightly orders, and feudal systems would have been transplanted into the region, altering local politics and architecture. Instead of a sharp divide between civilizations, this situation might have produced an unusual blending where Western institutions mixed with Eastern learning. In this alternate timeline, a kind of early Renaissance could have begun centuries before it did in Europe, sparked not in Italy, but in the Crusader states of the Levant. And what about the modern world? If the Crusades had succeeded, the long-term consequences would have reshaped the modern world entirely. Christianity could have remained a dominant force not only in Europe, but also across the Middle East, while Islamic powers might have shifted eastward or lost significant political influence. The Holy Land, along with surrounding territories, might resemble southern Europe today, with Christian institutions guiding governance, European-style architecture dotting the cities, and cultural life reflecting centuries of European presence. The effects would also reach global exploration and colonization. With Europeans controlling the trade routes through the Middle East, there may have been less urgency to find sea routes to India, China, or the Americas. This could have delayed or altered the age of exploration, giving European powers access to wealth and influence centuries earlier than in our timeline. The religious, political, and cultural map of the world might look completely different today, shaped by a prolonged European foothold in the Middle East and the blending of Eastern and Western civilizations long before the Renaissance. In the end, a successful crusade would not have meant peace. It would have meant centuries of conflict, shifting borders, and uneasy coexistence. The Holy Land might have become a permanent battleground, with Christians, Muslims, and Jews struggling for control of sacred sites. At the same time, this clash could have created an early, messy form of globalization where cultures blended, ideas mixed, and trade flourished, but always under the shadow of war. The consequences could have been both groundbreaking and catastrophic. On one hand, Europe could have advanced far earlier, gaining wealth, knowledge, and influence centuries ahead of schedule. On the other hand, the cost of endless war could have drained Europe dry, leaving it vulnerable to collapse. A world where the Crusades succeeded would not simply be more Christian, it would be an entirely different civilization, shaped by both triumph and tragedy. So, what do you think? Would a victorious crusade have created a golden age for Europe and Christianity, or plunged the world into endless war and division? The only thing certain is this: history, as we know, would never have been the same.